Well, I think the slim down was said in a day when there were a few more people around to make that seem like a justifiable comment.
On a quiet royal morning, one small jewel ignited a storm no one saw coming. The Jubilee Brooch, heavy with history and unspoken power, changed hands in a moment that stunned the palace. Princess Anne's decision to pass it to Catherine was deliberate, symbolic, and impossible to ignore. But what shocked courtiers most was who was denied. Inside the court, whispers lingered. Camilla's claim was flatly refused, raising whispers of loyalty, legacy, and authority. So was this gesture a silent warning about who holds the crown's future? When legacy quietly took control. Late in 2022, while the nation was still adjusting to life after Queen Elizabeth II, a quieter reckoning was unfolding beneath Buckingham Palace. Deep below the grand state rooms, behind reinforced doors and climate-controlled walls, the royal jewel vault stood in its usual stillness. The temperature was steady, the lighting soft and deliberate, designed to protect history itself. It was here that Princess Anne arrived one overcast morning, not as a ceremonial figure, but as the Queen's most trusted steward. Anne moved with purpose. Dressed simply, without pageantry, she walked past rows of velvet-lined drawers containing pieces that had marked coronations, jubilees, weddings, and decades of duty. This was not her first visit since her mother's passing in September 2022. As the review of Queen Elizabeth II's collection continued, Anne had taken on a central role, guided by memory as much as responsibility. Every drawer opened carried weight, but one in particular drew her attention almost immediately. Inside a dark velvet case rested the Jubilee Brooch. Its central sapphire, deep blue and unmistakable, caught the light even in the subdued vault. Diamonds framed it in a floral pattern that symbolized unity across the realms Elizabeth had served. Anne lifted it carefully, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. This was not simply a jewel. It marked 1977, the Silver Jubilee, when Elizabeth had stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony on June 7th, smiling at crowds that filled the mall. It marked 2002 as well, when the brooch had been enhanced with additional sapphires to honor 50 years on the throne. This piece carried a reign within it. In recent days, Anne had become aware that interest in the brooch had surfaced elsewhere. Camilla, now Queen Consort, had mentioned it privately as a meaningful way to honor Elizabeth's jubilees. It was not an unreasonable thought, and Anne did not dismiss it lightly. Yet standing in the vault, with the brooch resting in her palm, Anne's focus shifted away from requests and expectations. This was not a question of preference or status. It was about direction. Anne understood the difference between wearing history and carrying it forward. Certain pieces in the royal collection were never meant to circulate freely. They followed an invisible line, guided by tradition rather than title. The Jubilee Brooch, created to mark Elizabeth's milestones and worn at moments that defined her reign, belonged to that category. It symbolized continuity, not comfort. It was meant to bridge eras. As Anne returned the brooch to its case, memories surfaced uninvited. Her mother adjusting it before public appearances, commenting on its color, its balance, and its meaning. Elizabeth had always known which symbols mattered most, and why. Anne felt that understanding settled firmly within her. The decision did not require debate or approval. It required alignment with the Queen's long view of the monarchy. By the time the vault drawer closed, Anne's resolve was already clear. The Jubilee Brooch would not remain tied to the present moment. Its place was with the future of the crown, with the woman who would one day stand where Elizabeth once stood. As Anne turned away and walked back toward the palace corridors, the choice moved quietly ahead of any formal conversation, already shaping what would come next. But if Anne moved without permission, what other silent decisions are already shaping the monarchy's future beyond public sight? Stay with us. The line, Anne refused to let. Blur. Not long after Princess Anne left the jewel vault, word reached her of a quiet conversation that had already taken place elsewhere. It happened at Clarence House during an unremarkable afternoon tea shared by King Charles III and Camilla. The setting was calm, familiar, and far removed from the weight carried beneath Buckingham Palace. Over fine china and soft light, Camilla spoke thoughtfully about Queen Elizabeth II and the milestones that had defined her reign. In that reflective mood, she mentioned the Jubilee Brooch, suggesting it would be a fitting piece for her to wear in tribute to the late Queen's jubilees. Charles listened with understanding. He had watched Camilla grow into her role, navigating public scrutiny and private adjustment, and he appreciated her desire to honor his mother's legacy. At first, there was no resistance in his response, only the acknowledgement that the idea made emotional sense. Nothing was decided at that moment, but the suggestion lingered, quietly moving through palace channels until it reached Anne. When Anne learned of the discussion, she did not react with surprise or irritation. Instead, she paused. For her, this was not a personal matter, nor was it a judgment of Camilla's intentions. Anne had spent her life watching how symbols were passed down, understanding that some objects followed rules older than any one reign. The Jubilee Brooch was one of those objects. Anne's reasoning was shaped by precedent, not sentiment. Historically, certain jewels were worn by many, while others followed a direct line tied to the future of the crown. The Jubilee Brooch had been created in 1977 to mark Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee, a celebration of endurance after difficult post-war years. It was later enhanced in 2002 for the Golden Jubilee, reflecting 50 years of service. These were not moments shared lightly. They were defining chapters of a reign, and the brooch existed because of them. To Anne, this placed the piece in a different category altogether. It was not a consort's ornament, meant to rotate with changing roles. It was a reign-defining artifact, bound to continuity rather than convenience. Its meaning stretched forward, not sideways. That distinction mattered. Anne did not summon Camilla, nor did she challenge Charles directly. There was no confrontation, no need for raised voices or firm declarations. Her authority came from clarity. In her mind, the path was already drawn. The Jubilee Brooch belonged with the future Queen Consort, not the present one. That future was embodied in Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role was still unfolding but firmly anchored in what lay ahead. By holding to that interpretation, Anne quietly redrew a boundary that had never been written down, but had always been understood. Her decision was not a rejection of Camilla herself, but of the idea that every symbol must follow the title alone. Some symbols followed time. As the palace continued its routines, the choice settled into place without announcement. The brooch remained where Anne intended it to go, waiting. And while no one openly spoke of refusal, the message was clear enough to those who understood the weight of tradition. Anne had chosen continuity over courtesy, and in doing so, ensured that the Jubilee Brooch would continue its story along the line it was always meant to follow. So, what hidden message did Anne's quiet act send about tradition, power, and succession? And who truly controls the symbols of the crown? Stay tuned. A jewel that measured time. To understand why Princess Anne's decision felt settled rather than shocking, it helps to look closely at what the Jubilee Brooch truly represented. Its value was never rooted in sparkle alone. From the moment it was created, the brooch was designed to carry time, memory, and meaning in a way few royal jewels ever do. The story began in 1977, a year that marked 25 years of Queen Elizabeth II on the throne. Britain was emerging from difficult post-war decades, and the Silver Jubilee was more than a celebration. It was reassurance. To commemorate that milestone, the Crown commissioned Gerard and Company in London, the historic royal jeweler, to create a piece worthy of the moment. The result was the Jubilee Brooch, a central oval sapphire, deep blue and steady, framed by a floral arrangement of pavé-set diamonds, with subtle gold accents woven through the design. Every element was intentional. The sapphire symbolized endurance and calm. The diamonds represented unity across the realms Elizabeth served. On June 7, 1977, the brooch entered public memory. Queen Elizabeth II wore it during her balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace, standing before cheering crowds as aircraft passed overhead. Photographs from that day captured more than ceremony. They showed a monarch confident in her role, visibly connected to her people. The brooch sat prominently against her pastel gown, instantly linked to that defining image of her reign. Over the years, it became one of her most personal pieces. Elizabeth did not reserve it only for grand occasions. She wore it during moments that mattered to her: state banquets, important meetings, and quieter family gatherings. Those close to her recalled how she would sometimes comment on its weight, or adjust it herself, treating it less like an heirloom and more like a familiar companion. It reminded her of promises kept and responsibilities still unfolding. In 2002, as the Queen marked 50 years on the throne, the brooch evolved with her reign. To honor the Golden Jubilee, it was reset with additional sapphires, carefully integrated into the original design. The update did not change its identity, it deepened it. The brooch now carried two milestones within a single form, 25 years and 50 years, turning it into a visual record of service. Elizabeth wore it during events at Windsor Castle and Balmoral, where the celebrations were more reflective, surrounded by family rather than crowds. By then, the brooch had become something rare, a jewel that could trace the arc of a reign without words. It was tied to Elizabeth's sense of duty, her constancy, and her belief in continuity above all else. She spoke of it with familiarity, sometimes recalling the excitement of 1977, other times the quieter pride of 2002. Each time, the meaning returned to the same point: service over self. Seen in that light, the Jubilee brooch was never destined to be reassigned casually. It functioned as a timeline, marking not fashion or favor, but succession and stability. This was why years later, as Princess Anne weighed its future, the conclusion felt unavoidable. The brooch did not belong to a momentary role. It belonged to the long road ahead, carrying the story of a reign forward, waiting to rest where that story would continue rather than conclude. Now, what do you think the Jubilee brooch truly signals about the future of the monarchy, and who will inherit its hidden power next? Stay glued. Where duty met the past. By late October 2022, the work inside Buckingham Palace had shifted from mourning to responsibility. The jewel vault, hidden beneath the palace's grand rooms, became the quiet center of that transition. On a gray morning, Princess Anne returned there again, not for ceremony, but for clarity. The vault was sealed behind reinforced doors, its air carefully controlled, its silence broken only by the soft movement of gloved hands and the faint click of drawers being opened and closed. Waiting beside her was Eleanor Hargrove, the long-serving keeper of the jewels. With her ledger tucked under one arm and reading glasses resting low on her nose, she guided the process with precision. Each piece was catalogued, inspected, and recorded, following procedures refined over generations. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was casual. This was not simply an inventory. It was an accounting of history. Anne moved slowly through the rows, her expression steady but thoughtful. She recognized nearly every piece before it was named. Some carried memories of state banquets at Windsor Castle, where crystal glasses clinked beneath chandeliers. Others recalled Balmoral, quieter and more personal, where jewelry was worn not for spectacle but familiarity. As drawers slid open, moments returned uninvited. Fittings before Jubilee celebrations, rehearsals, where her mother adjusted a clasp or commented on how a piece sat against fabric. Always attentive, always exact. When the Jubilee brooch appeared again, resting inside its dark velvet case, the atmosphere shifted. Anne paused longer this time. She lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar balance in her hand. The deep blue sapphire caught the vault's light, steady and unchanged. For a moment, she was no longer standing beneath Buckingham Palace, but back at Windsor during preparations for the Silver Jubilee in 1977. She could almost hear her mother's voice, calm and practical, reminding aides that the brooch must sit just right. Later memories followed. Balmoral gatherings around the Golden Jubilee in 2002, where the added sapphires reflected 50 years of service rather than celebration alone. Eleanor quietly noted the brooch's details in her ledger, her pen moving steadily. But she did not interrupt. She understood when silence was required. Anne's grip tightened slightly, not from uncertainty, but from recognition. This moment felt heavier than the others. Until then, the Vault Review had been about preservation, about ensuring that Elizabeth II's collection was protected, stored, and documented with care. But standing there, Anne realized something had changed. This was no longer just about where the jewels would rest. It was about where their meaning would live. Elizabeth had always been clear about symbols. Some pieces were worn often, shared freely, allowed to evolve with fashion and circumstance. Others carried a deeper purpose. They were anchors, meant to steady the monarchy as faces changed and years passed. The Jubilee brooch belonged to that second group. It did not simply reflect the past, it pointed forward. Anne closed the velvet case with deliberate care. In that simple action, the tension sharpened. The choice ahead was not administrative. It was personal, historical, and unavoidably forward-looking. Whoever carried this brooch next would carry more than memory. They would carry expectations. As Anne moved on to the next drawer, the vault felt different. The weight she carried was no longer just her mother's absence, but the responsibility of deciding who would embody her presence in the years to come. And with that realization settled firmly in her mind, the path ahead became clearer, even as it grew more difficult. And what hidden power and legacy will the Jubilee brooch truly bestow? Who will bear the weight of history next, and why? Keep watching. A choice sealed in silence. By May 2023, the decision Princess Anne had carried for months was ready to move from intention to action. The setting was Kensington Palace, chosen not for grandeur, but for meaning. The Oak Room, warm and familiar, had long been a place for private family moments rather than public display. Soft daylight filtered through tall windows, settling across polished wood panels and antique furnishings. Outside, spring had fully arrived, and the quiet calm of the palace grounds stood in sharp contrast to the weight of what was about to take place inside. Catherine, Princess of Wales, arrived first. Her entrance was unassuming, marked by composure rather than anticipation. She wore a simple, elegant outfit, appropriate for a private gathering, her posture relaxed, yet attentive. William stood beside her, offering quiet reassurance, though neither spoke much. They understood this was not an occasion that required words. It required presence. Princess Anne entered shortly after, carrying herself with the same steadiness that had guided her through the months since her mother's passing. She did not carry notes, nor did she signal formality. In her hands was a small navy velvet case. unmistakable in its importance. The Jubilee brooch rested inside, unseen but felt by everyone in the room. There were no attendants calling attention to the moment, no speeches prepared for reflection. Anne stood facing Catherine, her expression calm, resolved. When she spoke, her voice was measured and direct, shaped by duty rather than sentiment. She spoke of her mother, not at length, but with precision. She reminded Catherine that Queen Elizabeth II's collection was never about decoration. Each piece carried purpose, responsibility, and expectation. The Jubilee brooch, she explained, marked defining chapters of a reign and belonged with the future it was meant to support. As Anne opened the case, the brooch caught the light instantly. The deep blue sapphire and surrounding diamonds appeared unchanged, timeless. Catherine stepped forward without hesitation. There was no visible surprise, only humility. Anne pinned the brooch carefully to Catherine's lapel, adjusting it slightly, just as Elizabeth once had done herself. The gesture was deliberate, almost reverent. In that quiet action, the message was complete. No announcement followed. No explanation was offered beyond what had already been understood. The transfer itself spoke clearly. By placing the Jubilee brooch on Catherine, Anne had drawn the line she had considered for so long. The brooch would not pass through the present role of queen consort. It had moved directly to the woman who would one day carry the crown forward. Camilla and King Charles entered shortly after. There was no tension in their expressions, only acknowledgement. Camilla's smile was composed, her manner gracious. She understood what had been decided without needing it spelled out. Charles, lifting his teacup in a small gesture of approval, recognized the continuity his sister had protected. The moment passed without discomfort, strengthened by mutual respect rather than challenged by it. As conversation turned to memories of Elizabeth's jubilees, the room softened, laughter surfaced briefly, reflections were shared, and the weight eased just enough to breathe. Yet the significance remained. What had taken place in the Oak Room did not need public confirmation. The line of succession had been reinforced quietly, decisively, and without dispute. When Catherine later glanced down at the brooch, its presence felt less like an honor and more like a responsibility newly claimed. And as Anne watched her, she knew the choice she had made in the vault months earlier had now become visible, irreversible, and firmly set into the future. So what hidden message does Catherine's brooch truly carry? Duty, power, or a secret shift in the monarchy's future trajectory? The quiet shift no one announced. Once the moment in the Oak Room had passed, life inside the palace resumed its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath the calm surface, the significance of what had occurred began to move quietly through Kensington Palace. Nothing was said openly, but nothing needed to be. Those who had spent years reading the unspoken language of the royal household understood that something important had settled into place. In the corridors and service rooms, staff exchanged brief glances as they went about their duties. Silver was polished, flowers refreshed, schedules maintained. A housekeeper paused a fraction longer than usual while arranging a table, murmuring to a colleague that Princess Anne had done what she always did, kept faith with tradition. A senior footman, careful with his words, remarked that the brooch now rested where it belonged. These were not rumors fueled by curiosity, but acknowledgments shaped by familiarity. The palace had seen many transitions, and this one carried the steady mark of continuity. Later that evening, away from the formality of shared spaces, William and Catherine had a moment alone. The nursery lights at Kensington Palace cast a warm glow as the sounds of their children drifted softly down the corridor. Catherine touched the brooch once more, still adjusting to its presence. It felt heavier than she had expected, not in weight, but in meaning. William watched her quietly before speaking, reminding her that his aunt's choice was about the future they were building for George, Charlotte, and Louis. It was not simply an honor, he said, but a sign of trust. Catherine nodded, understanding that what now rested on her lapel carried expectations that would unfold over years, not days. That same evening, Princess Anne began the drive back to Gatcombe Park. The countryside stretched out ahead of her, familiar and grounding. As the palace receded behind her, her thoughts turned inward. She reflected on conversations she had once shared with her mother about the purpose of royal possessions. Elizabeth had been clear that these objects were never owned in the ordinary sense. They were held, protected, and passed on with care. Anne felt certain she had followed that guidance. There was no triumph in her expression, only quiet resolve. At Clarence House, Camilla met the news with composure. She did not question the outcome, nor did she allow disappointment to show. Having navigated years of public scrutiny, she understood the distinction between personal feeling and institutional meaning. The Jubilee brooch had found its place, and she accepted that without protest. In the days that followed, she continued her public duties wearing her own collection, including pieces long associated with her role. There was no signal of rivalry, only adjustment. Publicly, nothing appeared altered. No statements were issued, no explanations offered. Yet within the royal family, roles had been subtly realigned. Catherine's position as the future queen consort had been reinforced without spectacle. Anne's role as guardian of continuity had been affirmed once more. Camilla's acceptance demonstrated stability rather than strain. The absence of conflict was, in itself, the message. The monarchy had moved forward without fracture, guided by respect rather than resistance. What had begun as a single gesture in a quiet room now echoed through the palace, in restrained understanding. And as attention gradually shifted outward, the deeper meaning of that transfer continued to settle, shaping the way the next chapter would soon be seen by the world beyond the palace gates. So, how did a single quiet gesture in a hidden vault reshape the future of the monarchy? And who truly controls its next chapter? When the symbol finally spoke. The meaning behind Princess Anne's decision remained unspoken until the moment the Jubilee brooch returned to public view. That moment came in June 2023, during one of Buckingham Palace's traditional garden parties. More than 8,000 guests filled the lawns, the air heavy with roses and freshly cut grass. Catherine, Princess of Wales, moved calmly among them in a pale blue silk outfit. Composed and attentive. Pinned neatly to her lapel, the deep blue sapphire of the Jubilee brooch caught the afternoon light. For those who recognized it, the message landed instantly. There was no formal announcement and no guidance from palace officials. Still, cameras lingered. Commentators noticed. Since Queen Elizabeth II's death, the brooch had not appeared on any other royal, and its placement was unmistakably deliberate. Catherine wore it with ease, as though it had always been part of her story, greeting guests with quiet confidence. Within hours, images spread widely, and observers described the moment as subtle, yet decisive. The brooch had entered a new phase of its life. That signal was reinforced only days later on an even larger stage. Trooping the color in June 2023 drew crowds to the mall and millions more watching worldwide. The royal family gathered on the Buckingham Palace balcony, a setting deeply tied to Elizabeth II's jubilees. Catherine stood beside Prince William, their children close, the picture of continuity. Against her tailored pale blue coat, the Jubilee brooch shimmered once more. For many watching, the connection was unavoidable. This was the same balcony where Elizabeth had worn the brooch decades earlier to mark milestones of her reign. Now it rested on the woman expected to one day stand at the heart of that scene. Reaction followed quickly but remained measured. The Daily Telegraph described the brooch as a signal of continuity, pointing to its careful reappearance at moments linked to the crown's future. The Times focused on the historical weight of royal heirlooms and the clarity of their placement. Across social media, the response was immediate. Images of Elizabeth wearing the brooch in 1977 and 2002 were shared alongside photographs of Catherine, drawing clear lines across generations. Praise centered on Catherine's ability to honor tradition without excess. For a brief period, discussion of the Jubilee brooch trended, driven more by admiration than controversy. Later that year, the brooch appeared again, this time under chandeliers rather than open sky. At a state dinner at Windsor Castle in autumn 2023, Catherine arrived in an emerald evening gown. The Jubilee brooch set prominently at her shoulder. The atmosphere was formal, attended by international guests, diplomats, and senior members of the royal household. Conversations paused as eyes were drawn to the familiar sapphire. Vogue later highlighted the craftsmanship of the piece, while The Guardian described it as a visual confirmation of succession, expressed without words. Notably, no competing narrative emerged. Queen Camilla continued her duties with composure, wearing jewels long associated with her role, including the Burmese ruby tiara on appropriate occasions. The contrast was clear, but not confrontational. Each woman carried symbols suited to her position, and the balance held. For Princess Anne, watching these appearances confirmed what she had already understood during the Vault review months earlier. The brooch had found its place. There was no backlash, no confusion, only recognition. The public understood because it had been shown, not explained. As Catherine continued to wear the Jubilee brooch, its meaning expanded. It no longer belonged only to the memory of Elizabeth II's reign. It became a bridge between past celebration and future responsibility. Without ceremony or statement, succession had been signaled as continuity. The Jubilee brooch had always marked time, but now it marked the direction. So, what do you think this quiet transfer of the Jubilee brooch is? Could it really signal power, succession, and loyalty inside the monarchy? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.